So I was just scrolling through on Twitter, and like I said, things just pop up on my timeline thanks to this messed up algorithm. And Tim Fool popped up on my timeline yet again. And I did a video about Tim Pool like maybe about a month ago, and he was talking about a bunch of nonsense. Then he's talking nonsense right here. So he made this post because, of course, everything that's going on with SNAP benefits and all that stuff that, when November came in, they ended up cutting the benefits off. By the time this video goes up, I don't know where this shutdown is going to be at. I don't know if it'll finally be over or if it's still going to be ongoing. But Tim Pool made this post right here, and it's so idiotic. He said, end all welfare programs, all subsidies, and all government grants. And I'm sitting here saying to myself, so you think it's just that easy? Just turn all of that stuff off? I'm like, do you not know the stuff that'll be affected if you was to just flat out turn all of that off? And it's like, Tim, also, are you going to sit here and also tell me the same age-old trope that you think it's only black people that benefit from SNAP and all types of stuff like that? I don't know if y'all have seen it lately, but there have been some AI videos that have been floating around of black people, quote unquote, acting belligerent when it talks about getting rid of welfare and SNAP benefits and everything like that. And they got exposed as being AI videos, and of course the usual suspects were the ones pushing them as if it was only black people that were going crazy about losing their benefits, when we all know, and it's documented, that it's mainly PC individuals that get a lot of these SNAP and welfare benefits from the government. But they got to keep pushing that narrative. But what I decided to do was I wanted to turn this into, I guess you can say, a deep dive. And usually, I would throw imagery up there to guide people along with the narrative that's being told. But I said, you know what? I'm going to leave this up here, and y'all going to listen to what I have to say and just literally listen to what I'm saying, but also pay attention to what Tim Pool put up here and realize how ridiculous he is and how dumb he sounds with this 3-lined post. So let's start with the terrifying question. It's a simple one, but it can be terrifying. What would happen if the United States gradually phased out every government subsidy? So notice I'm talking about gradually fading out every subsidy. Tim Pool is putting it up here as if we should just swiftly get it out of the way. Like, you wake up and it's gone. That'll be horrific. But what if it was a gradual fade out of what he's talking about? And I'm talking about WIC, SNAP, welfare, housing assistance, unemployment aid, Medicaid, and so on and so forth. Not overnight chaos like this one is talking about, but a step-by-step, slowly removing the lifelines that millions of people rely on. And also, let me just say this, a lot of the people that get SNAP and benefit and WIC and all that, a lot of those people do have jobs and they work. It's just that they don't meet a certain threshold in order to not receive those benefits, because I forgot what the threshold is, but you can't make it over a certain amount and receive it. So they're under it. So basically they're living under the poverty line. They're still working, but they are still getting government assistance as well because they don't meet the threshold to not get it. At first glance, some might say that's great. Less government, more personal responsibility. And yeah, there's this libertarian fantasy in there somewhere, where a nation of where everyone stands on their own and no one gets a handout and everyone succeeds or fails purely on merit. But the reality doesn't work like a philosophy textbook. Reality can be messy because it's human. And when millions of Americans lose access to basic food, healthcare, and housing, even in gradual, the consequences ripple across every corner of the economy, society, and political system. So today we're going to explore exactly what would happen if the US withdrew the social safety net piece by piece or thread by thread, and what that means for people who rely on it, for communities, and for the nation as a whole. And we're going to go into some of the numbers, the social consequences, and the moral questions. So the first thing I wanted to talk about in the initial phase out is how families would be affected. The first step is the government announces it will gradually reduce WIC and SNAP benefits over 5 years. For a single mother in, say, rural Mississippi, or a family in an inner city such as like Detroit, this is huge. Suddenly the grocery bill isn't just higher, now it has become like almost like a demolishing effect. SNAP alone feeds over 40 million Americans monthly. WIC supports over 6 million low-income women and children. If you was to remove that, and millions of families must stretch a fixed income even further. The immediate result of that is diets become less nutritious, kids will go hungry, and food insecurity skyrockets. See, a lot of people don't take into consideration that this will start to affect people who do not get SNAP and WIC. They think it's only going to affect people who are on it. And food insecurity isn't about just hunger. It's linked to poor school performance, chronic health issues, and long-term developmental delays in children. And those subtle impacts compound year after year. And while some might think, well, people will just work harder, the problem is that many low-income households are already working multiple jobs, like I just mentioned earlier. The issue isn't laziness, it's structure. Structural wages haven't kept pace with living costs. And if you remove subsidies, it doesn't fix that. It actually makes it worse. Housing subsidies follow. Section 8 and public housing programs shelter over 2 million families nationwide. As benefits begin to shrink, eviction rates will start to climb. Rents don't just magically fall. Landlords still need to cover mortgages, taxes, and maintenance. So what we see is a rise in homelessness, particularly in urban centers where housing markets are the tightest. Entire neighborhoods begin to see a strain on emergency shelters and charitable organizations. Then healthcare gets hit. Medicaid covers over 70 million Americans. Even a slow reduction leaves millions without coverage. Preventable illnesses become a crisis. Families make impossible choices. I mean, do you pay for your insulin or do you pay for your rent? Do you take your child to the ER for an asthma attack, or do you skip it and hope for the best? Health outcomes plummet and the burden shifts to hospitals and then communities. The next thing that starts to get affected is the economic domino effect. Once basic subsidies are gone, the economy starts to teeter and totter a little bit. Low-income families are huge consumers. They spend every dollar they earn, mostly on essentials such as food, rent, utilities, and transportation. If you was to remove those subsidies and disposable income drops, consumer spending slows, hitting local businesses first. Grocery stores, pharmacies, public transportation systems, they all see a reduction in revenue. Small businesses, often reliant on local customers, begin to fail. Layoffs start to climb. Suddenly, it's not just the families who relied on benefits who feel it. Workers in local economies lose jobs too. And here's the kicker. The lost revenue from subsidies reduce tax collection. So the government collects less money as economic slows. Ironically, the idea of saving money by eliminating welfare begins to collapse under its own weight. So let's also, while we're talking about food, let's talk about food prices. SNAP, WIC, and other programs are a major source of demand for groceries. Gradually removing them doesn't just reduce access, it affects market stability. Stores raise prices to offset losses, or they reduce supply in poor neighborhoods. Inflation hits the very people the phase out targets. You might think inflation is a distant economic term, but for families living paycheck to paycheck, a $2 increase in milk is the difference between eating and skipping a meal. There's also social consequences, which also can become strains on various communities. The first phase of the subsidy withdrawal exposes what many communities have been silently managing: vulnerability. Nonprofits, churches, and charities initially step in to fill the gaps. Food banks see lines double. Volunteer hours begin to spike, but there's only so much goodwill to go around. As shortages continue, social tensions start to rise. Schools see higher absenteeism as children come to class hungry or sick. Juvenile delinquency begins to increase. Research consistently links food insecurity and economic stress to higher rates of youth crime. Communities feel pressure points in ways government statisticians have never captured. Public health suffers. Lower access to nutrition and healthcare leads to increased illnesses, mental health crisis, and chronic disease. Emergency rooms and local chronics become overwhelmed. Cities may try to implement stopgap measures, but without federal funding, these efforts are under-resourced and fail to scale. Crime patterns begin to shift. Property crime rises in areas where desperation starts to grow. Theft, burglary, and petty crime are direct consequences of sudden scarcity. Meanwhile, the wealthy or the better off neighborhoods remain largely unaffected. Which then deepens the divide. You will see a bifurcated society, one increasingly that's desperate and the other that is insulated. Then, this is probably a major one, the political fallout, because now trust is going to start to dissipate. Phasing out subsidies isn't just an economic or social problem, it's also a political one. Citizens accustomed to a safety net began to feel abandoned. Local and state governments face pressure to step in, but budgets are already strained. Tax revolts emerge, protests start to grow, political polarization intensifies because people blame leaders across the spectrum. States try different approaches. Some attempt their own subsidy programs, others refuse. Wealthier states may weather the storm, but poorer states, historically relying on federal assistance, begin to struggle. This creates a patchwork America, where some communities survive relatively intact and others collapse under economic stress. Federal elections become referendums on social survival. Public trust in institutions starts to dissipate as families struggle to reconcile promises of freedom and prosperity with the harsh realities of daily life, which gradually we see the beginning of political instability. Movements on both extremes start to gain traction. A lot of people don't talk about how this has long-term implications, and it has what I call a generational effect. Even a gradual phase out has generational consequences. Children growing up in poverty without access to nutrition, healthcare, or educational support face barriers that persist into adulthood. Studies have shown that early life deprivation reduces lifetime earnings, increases susceptibility into chronic illness, and heightens vulnerability to crime and substance abuse. The workforce ends up suffering as well. A less healthy, less educated population struggles to compete in a modern economy. Labor productivity declines. Industry reliant on skilled workers face shortages. High-tech sectors may still thrive, but the overall economy becomes stagnant because the foundation of low and middle income consumers have now been hollowed out. We also see a moral erosion. When society gradually removes its safety net, empathy now becomes tested. Communities fracture. Quote-unquote others are blamed for systematic failures. Social cohesion, already fragile in polarized environments, becomes even more weaker. By now, you can start to see the picture. A gradual withdrawal of government subsidies doesn't just impact the poor, it reshapes the economy as an entirety, destabilizes communities, weakens institutions, and creates a society where desperation becomes a defining characteristic. What started as a policy experiment becomes a slow-motion social crisis, and yet this is only the first half of the story. The next stages, you talk about deep economic collapse, national security pressures, and the ultimate consequences of the fabric of American society are even more profound. As the phase out starts to continue, the economic dominoes fall further. Businesses that relied on consumer spending in lower income communities start to collapse. Small retailers, restaurants, and service providers start to vanish, leaving behind ghost towns and areas where subsidies once helped keep commerce alive. Wages stagnate or they just decline altogether. As households tighten budgets, demand for labor in local markets starts to drop. Workers compete for fewer jobs, forcing employers to offer lower wages. Poverty deepens. Middle-class families once buffered by dual incomes now feel the squeeze. Many slide into economic insecurity as savings run out and debts start to accumulate. Housing markets destabilize even further. Evictions start to go up. Homelessness starts to rise, and urban centers see tent cities start to grow. Suburban areas, historically insulated, begin to experience strain as families relocate in search of affordable shelter. The mismatch between supply and demand drives rent even higher, and in some areas creating pockets of extreme scarcity. Healthcare collapse then becomes the next domino to fall. Without Medicaid or other subsidies, preventative care declines. Hospitals in low-income neighborhoods struggle as uninsured patients flood emergency rooms. Chronic illnesses like diabetes and hypertension become widespread public health crises. Productivity drops further as workers spend more days sick or caring for sick family members. Inflation compounds the problem. Food, rent, and energy costs continue to rise while wages start to stagnate. This isn't just a number on a report. It's a daily reality for millions of Americans. Families face impossible choices. So it's like, do you pay for heat? medicine or groceries. That's literally the options that you're left with, and you have to choose one of them. And when enough families hit that breaking point, social unrest becomes inevitable, which leads me into the next point, a social tipping point where desperation and unrest will start to ensue. The slow dismantling of the safety net doesn't just create economic hardship, it creates social instability. Communities that were already struggling now face constant stress. Hunger, illness, and eviction erode trust. People begin to turn inward, relying on family, neighbors, and informal networks. Crime patterns shift dramatically. Property crime increases first, such as theft, burglaries, and robberies rise as people struggle to meet basic needs. Organized crime sees opportunity, offering predatory solutions, quote unquote, to desperate communities. Meanwhile, drug and alcohol abuse surge as individuals attempt to cope with chronic stress. Schools, already underfunded in many areas, collapse under additional pressures. Attendance drops. Behavioral patterns start to increase, and teacher burnout accelerates. The generational gap widens. Children growing up in poverty without social support face lifelong barriers. Communities once bound by stability and pride now experience fragmentation. The moral cost is significant. When society removes support for the vulnerable, judgment and blame take root. Political rhetoric often scapegoats the poor, framing poverty as a personal failing rather than a result of a systemic change. Communities fracture not just economically, but ethically. And by the third or fourth stage of the phase out, political consequences become unavoidable. States try to fill the gaps in subsidies, but resources are limited. Wealthier states may implement emergency programs, but poor states cannot. The result is stark regional inequality. Federal trust erodes. Citizens perceive abandonment. Movements demanding intervention start to grow, from grassroots level protests to more extreme factions advocating radical change. Political polarization deepens as blame is cast across party lines. The social contract, the implicit agreement that the government ensures minimum standards of living, begins to unravel. Elections become battlegrounds over survival and not even policy anymore. Populist leaders promising immediate relief or radical change gain traction. The very foundation of democratic stability is tested when a significant portion of the population feels abandoned by its system. Over the decades, the slow removal of subsidies leaves scars on society entirely. Children raised in poverty without consistent access to food, healthcare, and housing experience developmental delays that persist into adulthood. Their earning potential decreases, health starts to deteriorate, and social mobility begins to collapse. The labor force itself has weakened. Industries that rely on healthy, educated workers face chronic shortages. Manufacturing, healthcare, and technology sectors may survive in isolated regions, but the overall economy suffers. Consumer demands, the engine of capitalism, slows because the very people who fuel it no longer have the means to participate. Communities fracture morally and socially. Neighbors start to turn against their neighbors. Blame replaces empathy, and social cohesion starts to erupt. Civic engagement declines because survival becomes a daily priority. Political institutions struggle to function effectively, and a nation once united under shared goals now experiences tension on multiple fronts. Meanwhile, the wealthy largely remain insulated from the cascading effects of subsidy removal. Their children continue to access private schools, private healthcare, and safe housing. The middle class shrinks as families are pushed into poverty, and the divide between the rich and the poor starts to widen dramatically. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. History shows us the consequences of extreme inequality. Society with widening wealth gaps experience lower social trust, higher crime rates, and reduced overall well-being. A gradual phase-out of subsidies accelerates this divide, creating a nation where opportunity is determined almost entirely by the accident of birth rather than the effort, skill, and ambition. Beyond economics and politics, there's a moral question. What kind of society is willing to allow millions to struggle simply because it values ideology over compassion? Subsidies are not perfect. Bureaucracies exist, fraud exists, and inefficiencies persist, but they represent a societal acknowledgement. Some level of shared responsibility is necessary to prevent extreme suffering. Gradually removing them challenges this principle. It forces individuals to face choices no one should have to make. And those choices of children going hungry, family losing their homes, healthcare becoming a privilege rather than a right. Empathy becomes a luxury, not a foundation. So what did we learn from this, I guess you could say, this thought process? A gradual phase out of all U.S. government subsidies would not just impact the poor, it would ripple across every layer of society. The economy would slow, communities would fracture, political instability would rise, and generational trauma would deepen. Wealth polarization would explode, and the moral fabric of the nation would be tested like never before. The story isn't just about numbers or policies, it's about people's lives. It's about children going to bed hungry, parents forced to make impossible choices, communities unraveling in slow motion. And it's about us as the people, as a society, deciding whether we value compassion, stability, and shared responsibility, or whether we gamble with the lives of millions in pursuit of an ideological vision of quote-unquote self-reliance. We can't ignore what subsidies do. They are lifelines, not luxuries. Gradually removing them is not just an economic experiment, it is a social and moral one with consequences that reverberate throughout generations. If nothing else, this should force us to ask a very difficult question. What kind of country do we want to be? A nation that abandons its most vulnerable in the name of principle, or one that recognizes that sometimes caring for your next person is the truest form of freedom and strength? So think about that the next time someone says government programs create dependencies, or like what Tim Pool put up here saying in all welfare programs, all subsidies and government grants. Sometimes the real dependency is on a justice and willingness of a society to protect its own, because without it, the consequences are real, harsh, and extremely long lasting.